was on. Kia ora tātou, everyone. I just wanted to introduce Alison and her team. Thanks to Councillor Brown for chairing. I'll just be supporting the team as they go through this inquiry submission. And I think it's about a 20-minute prezzo, isn't it? And we've got time for questions, etc. So over to you, Alison.
Should we start with a karakia and then I'll introduce the team? Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihe, mauri ora. Kia ora. So I have with me, I'm Alison, I'm the Manager of Climate Change Response. We have Jamuna, who is our Principal Advisor on Adaptation, our lead now, yes, and Sam Chadmana, who's our Principal Advisor on Adaptation, and Caden Watts, who is our Principal Engagement Advisor, Climate Adaptation. So it's like 3 of the 4 members of the adaptation crew, really, who've all been working hard both on our starting our roadmap work that you approved in April and also writing this submission. So the purpose of our workshop, Jamuna is going to take you through, and the team are going to take you through the key issues in the submission, what we're proposing to write on behalf of Council. So we're going to go through an overview of both of those and then get your feedback and talk about next steps.
Kia ora. Thanks, Alison. So thanks everybody for coming along today. So the purpose of this workshop is to go through the inquiry into climate adaptation. So this first little section will just be a brief overview about the purpose of the inquiry. And so this inquiry into adaptation was initiated by the Parliament's Environment Committee. And the purpose of the inquiry is to explore some of the quite complex and challenging issues around climate adaptation planning, but particularly for managed retreat. So those key questions around who pays and who decides are really at the centre of the inquiry. And they really set out that they're quite interested to learn more about the current practice in community-led adaptation planning. They're keen to hear about lessons from across the country, to learn more about what mechanisms could improve the future of this work, funding and finance mechanisms, and that type of practical advice.
It's probably worth pointing out that they're not proposing, it's not a discussion on a bill or even proposals for a bill. It's purely a let's chat about some ideas, kind of a consultation. So it's not the most satisfying process to engage with, but it does get us an opportunity to say the same messages that we've previously said to government.
That's right. And so this issues and options paper is, I guess, a piece of research that will help the government inform the proposed Climate Adaptation Act. And so the paper really covers 2 parts around thinking about what legislation needs to be set up for the Climate Adaptation Act, as well as thinking about the process for supporting communities to plan for adaptation, or plan for climate change. And so I expect most of you will be familiar with this. So the Climate Adaptation Act has been proposed as part of the Resource Management Act reform program. So it is or was one of 3 acts that would support climate resilience. Obviously, post-election, there will be some changes to this program of work, which I'll get to. But really the purpose of the Climate Adaptation Act is to clarify a range of technical challenges around planning how to plan for managed retreat and wider adaptation issues. And so after the election on the weekend, obviously with the new government, there's likely to be some changes with the proposed repeal of the Spatial Planning Act and the Natural and Built Environment Act. In terms of this inquiry that we're talking to you about today, the proposal pre-election is that the inquiry, which will close, submissions close on the 1st of November, and it was proposed that the research through the inquiry would support the introduction of the Climate Adaptation Act as a bill in late 2024. Post-election, we might see some changes to this timeframe. That was just an indication. And so I guess maybe it's just worth noting that looking at the new government's 100-day plan, that climate adaptation looks like we're seeing strong support for the climate adaptation work, and that is referenced in their blueprint for a better environment policy. So in terms of the next steps with the submission, so looking forward to the discussion and getting feedback from you today. But we're working towards a time frame of getting the paper to you on the next week, so the 25th of October, and that will allow us to finalise the submission and make the submission by the 1st of November. So that's a bit of a whistle-top overview of the purpose of the submission. So the next part of our presentation today will be to go through the submission in a little bit of detail with you. Before we get into that, just thought I'd highlight that we have been, as we've been preparing the submission, we've also been in conversation with other councils around the country, particularly through the Aotearoa Climate Adaptation Network, where we're looking to try and build some consistent messages from the local government sector as much as possible as well. Okay, so the submission, it covers 8 different chapters, so there's a range of topics that we'll be covering today. There are 43 questions that have been set out in the inquiry. We're not going to go through all 43 questions with you today, but we've tried to pick the ones that we think are probably most relevant to Wellington City Council or might be most controversial, and we would very much welcome your feedback and direction on. And so the topics are about need for change, facility-based adaptation planning, climate change risk assessments, local adaptation planning, community-led retreat, funding and financing, as well as adaptation through recovery. And I just wanted to point out that the submission, it does cover adaptation planning holistically, but there is a particular focus on the retreat option for adaptation planning because of the complexities around that type of intervention.
Excuse me, Jimena, just quickly,
Yes.
Sean, can you just provide some, well, actually, Alison, you might know this as well. What was the actual status of the Climate Adaptation Act? Where is it in the parliamentary process?
They haven't started it. is its current status. And it was intended to be the third plank of RMA reform.
Oh, that as described in that picture. Okay, yep.
Yeah, so they were repealing the RMA and replacing it with 3 acts. 2 of those have gone through the process, and then this was the third plank, and it was going to be later. I mean, the government has said that they would like the new incoming government, should they successfully form, has said that they would like to repeal those acts. They have, however, committed. National has a strong policy statement about wanting to provide policy certainty around adaptation. So I think in light of the storm events, they're committed to coming up with a framework. Right. But whether that will take longer or have to be different or
sure.
How long's a piece of string?
And just for the benefits of the councillors, I'm just trying to get some clarity on also, where do they actually get to in development of this Act?
So this Act has not been introduced to Parliament. It hasn't had its first reading. It remains a proposal.
Thank you.
Just a question on the timing of that, just on Liam's question. So if it's a proposal, what does that go into Parliament? What does that mean? That means a long time between looking at it, or what does that actually mean in timing?
So one of the first things the government will do after the ministers are sworn in is they will agree the legislative program. That will determine whether this ever becomes a bill and then an act, or whether they send it back for a new white paper to be redrafted. But as it stands, what we have here is effectively a piece of government research that's designed to inform a policy position.
Yeah, so given the uncertainty though, do officers still think it's valuable to go through this exercise so that the council itself can get its own position straight no matter what happens, and that's publicised? That's part of the point?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we do still see value in that as officers, and this work will be valuable. The fact that it's a parliamentary inquiry, it gives them the chance to. They have already had an expert report. They're getting feedback on this issues and options paper. It gives them a chance to publicly test a lot of the ideas that have particularly been put forward by researchers and engage their acceptability, I guess, to the elected public, to the public at large, and that will help them know in what direction they should take it forward. So it's incredibly valuable research for them and useful for them to know what local government think of it, because we are the ones who will do it underneath this legislative framework. So definitely worth us submitting, probably also worth councillors going in person to the inquiry if asked.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. The first thing that we're going to present to you is the key bullet points in the cover letter. And so we've tried to pick out some of the key themes or most important aspects of the submission. So really in the cover letter, we are thanking the government for the opportunity and commending their research led by the expert working group. And generally, we are stating that we agree with a lot of the content in the paper itself. Our key pieces of feedback on the inquiry where we feel like there's opportunity to strengthen the information in there is around emphasising the importance of the Climate Adaptation Act with some urgency. It is also about council cannot adequately support the needs in communities without the new powers, funding and financing discussed in the paper. We emphasise the importance of working with local communities and mana whenua in the implementation of planning with communities, but suggest that the language around community-led managed retreat may not be appropriate, and Sam will unpack that in a bit of detail next. We also propose that community adaptation planning processes like managed retreat need to be firmly grounded in te tiriti approaches. We call for more national standardisation in guidance and practical tools to help councils be able to deliver on local adaptation planning. And we also call for greater alignment with the draft national policy statement on natural hazard decision making, which is also out for consultation at the moment. And so we will, the next part of the presentation will be to unpack this chapter by chapter so we can revisit whether those key topics are agreed to.
All right, sure.
And so I'll pass over to Sam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amuna. My task is basically to just run you through an overview basically of each and every chapter, picking up the main issues that are material to us as a council. In chapter 1, I think the paper is setting the context, and I think the most important thing to note is that the government is actually doing something in terms of trying to get adaptation and policy and legislative framework around managed retreat, so which is actually a very positive trajectory. And the paper itself, and actually coming from the government itself, there is quite a very clear position, and they concede that there is at the moment no enduring and comprehensive system of managed retreat in the country. We haven't really agreed on how it would look like, what it would entail in terms of costs, who makes decisions, and all those aspects. So there's a bit of work that still needs to be done to develop that. Then the other part, of course, is the issue of funding. And I think it has remained one of the crucial issues on this topic, I think, since it started, as to who pays for this managed retreat. The next aspect, basically, answering the question, what do we think about community-led retreat? I guess the community-led part is important, it's vital, especially that the government is suggesting a cost-sharing mechanism between the property owners, councils, and government itself. Decisions will need to be made in a way that actually they are made at the local area where the actual impacts are going to be. So we support the community-led part. It's the retreat side of it that we feel does not totally encompass what international best practice would be. And that is looking at the issues of retreating. The questions you might ask when you see retreat is retreat to what? And what does it entail? Do you just move people from one place to another without providing the safeguards that are required and ensuring that also the user land use rights are also preserved? All those aspects that are supposed to be taken care of in that aspect. And we therefore felt that probably a much more comprehensive and much more kind of involving term would be resettlement or planned relocation. In that context, we are taking responsibility to the fact that we're moving people from one place to another, and the whole process of moving resettlement and ensuring that there's continuity in land use rights, but also economic opportunities, because there's a very close relation between where people stay and the economic activities and well-being. How do you preserve the whole spectrum of people's livelihoods and lifestyles? So that's the reason why we've suggested that as a decision. Chapter 2 essentially looks around, I would consider it a summary of some of the main issues that I raised in this paper. And therefore you begin to realize that in chapter 2, the government does a very good job of highlighting the four main issues that we are faced with in terms of adaptation and managed retreat in this country. And the first one is Maori participation. The second one, of course, is the variability in the risk assessments. There's a challenge that we are all doing what we call risk assessments, but our approaches in terms of methodology, data, and the review times of these assessments are all not standardized. Each council is doing its own, depending on which consultancy they are using. Then, of course, there's the other issue of the lack of a comprehensive system and, of course, the funding. So we agree with these issues that the paper raises, and we are in full support of their assessment or the analysis that has happened in terms of that. So what we want to talk about, for us, I think the most important aspect is looking at mana whenua participation in this process, looking at historical and legacy issues that come into that space. It becomes quite vital that there's deliberate action that is taken to create partnerships, capacity for mana whenua, and ensuring that there is a certain level of decision making that they do in terms of their own climate risk assessments and planning for their own adaptation. And my colleague Caden will talk more about that in a short while. But on the other part, we're also looking at the need for support in that aspect. I won't go into much detail at this stage, I think, because chapter 4, 5, and 6 will give more details of what we're trying to suggest there as the additional issues that central government should provide. On that note, I'll hand over to Caden to take us through chapter 3.
Ka pai, thank you, Sam. Kia ora koutou, ko Caden Watts tōku ingoa huria hau no Ngāti Tūwhareto, Ngāti Maniapoto, Ngāi Tūhoi Hoki. Thanks, Sam. We're going to be talking about some of the kōrero that came up in Chapter 3 around te tiriti-based adaptation approaches. And so some of the key points that came up during this chapter, the first one, iwi, hapu and Māori are disproportionately affected by climate change. And this is a very important one to outline from the start because it really dictates how we approach working with Māori and mana whenua in Te Whanganui Atara. Some of those disproportionate effects are large proportions of land and low-lying areas being vulnerable to climate change. Many of these taonga lands are in coastal or steep marginal areas, and much of this land is in the home of marae urupa and cultural sites. And so that needs its own dedicated approach that's led by Māori in order for us to address that. Te ao Māori and local mātauranga should be central to the development of these risk assessments and adaptation planning at place. And the Crown must proactively work with iwi, hapu and Māori to uphold Māori rights and interests, including through protecting Māori land and upholding treaty settlements. And a really important point at the end here, space should be created for iwi, hapu and Māori to have rangatira over their whenua, taonga katoa in a tiriti-based adaptation system. And that's really interesting wording that's being used in that chapter. Space should be created for iwi, hapu and Māori to have rangatira over their whenua. And we'll jump into what that means for us as we cover some of the points that we've made in our response. So WCC strongly agrees with the need to create space for tino rangatiratanga to support a te tiriti-based adaptation planning locally. And so to create space for rangatiratanga, you need to give space for Māori and mana whenua to lead those adaptation processes. A mātauranga-based framework for adaptation planning means that Māori need to be at the forefront. And WCC's role in that can be providing that resourcing, it can be providing that space, providing that technical expertise, so mana whenua can lead that process. WCC strongly encourages additional funding and other resources be made available to enable mana whenua to lead and participate in local and regional adaptation planning, and we note mātauranga-based frameworks can only be developed by mana whenua and Māori communities. And it's a very important point that that's not for WCC, for any government agency to dictate what a mātauranga-based framework looks like. That is at the decision of mana whenua and for us to be informed by them. WCC strongly recommends that managed retreat should be the last solution action regarding Māori land and adaptation planning, and mana whenua to lead the advice on appropriate areas and methods of relocation. And so that's an acknowledgement that relocation for mana whenua is very different than relocation for non-Māori communities because of the whakapapa that Māori have, mana whenua have with those lands. And WCC strongly supports the recommendations from the expert working group to align the approach to te tiriti according to the following principles. Partnership approach grounded in the principles of te tiriti, recognition of context, preservation of mana and rangatiratanga, system flexibility, holistic and equitable funding. Back to you, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kaden. I'll now just take you through the fourth chapter, which looks around climate risk assessments. The overview is that in the country at the moment, there's a lot of variability in the quality of the climate risk assessments that we are doing, for the reasons I stated earlier, and that has to do with the fact that differences in methodology, data, and at times differences in the consultancy company that you bring in to do that work. So there are opportunities to improve the quality of our assessments and the data that comes out of these assessments. And of course, there's a lot of, a bit of tokenism that is going on in most of these risk assessments as far as bringing in Mataranga Maori into the actual climate risk assessments. Our position as a council is that we agree that there is need for us to begin to the mainstreaming of Mataranga Maori into the climate risk assessments needs to be more decisive and more emphatic. At the moment, there's just a bit of having a framework in a document that is not really attached to the actual elements that are being discussed. We haven't really gone to the level where we're doing that effectively. The other point that we wanted to raise is that the government has put aside, through the Climate Emergency Response Fund, about 25 million that they have earmarked, and that is for data infrastructure in the country. What we don't have is centers of truth where we can use same data from a national that is brought down to the local levels in terms of adaptation. But what this funding will provide is streamlined and aligned data management systems in the country so that we speak from the same truth in terms of coastal inundation, whether it's flooding, whether it's any of those aspects. So we support that move and hoping that probably it will be sustained with the change of government. The other issue is just the standardization in methodology. What one council does in the north of this country should be the same thing that the council in the south does in the way we approach our climate risk assessments. And we really support the issue that there's need for a lot of capacity support to councils, especially the smaller councils that do not have both the manpower and the resources. And on the other part, we also just want to, there's an issue where most of these assessments have now been set up to be dependent on whether a risk is tolerable or a risk is not tolerable. Our position on that is that it will be very, very difficult because of the subjectivity of the matter for us to set up a national standard on what is tolerable and what is not tolerable. I think tolerability should be determined at the community level, at the impact level. You can't define what tolerability is at the national level because there are many factors that need to be put into that place. While we support the idea to go ahead with such a system, we are just putting caution up there that there is need for us to define exactly what that would look like. What flexibilities are going to be built in such a system to allow for local discretion on what tolerability is. Moving on to the issue of adaptation, with the RMA reforms that are coming, what I could say is that we are looking for more prominence of councils in that space as to what the role of councils will be in adaptation planning. We're also looking at the issue of standardizing the quality of the adaptation plans that are being developed at the local level. We're also in some way looking for more direction from national government on this issue. So those are some of the issues that are raised in the paper. And from our side, in our response, we have decided it's critical that nationally we begin to look at aspects of making it mandatory for us to do adaptation planning. That is, through the RMA reforms or the local government reforms, it is critical that we begin to give some form of mandate for councils, because at the moment, adaptation planning remains an unfunded mandate. It's not a legislated mandate, but would want it to be actually considering its importance. Then on the other part, there is need for support to councils to provide the practical tools there is need for council to provide the data, like we spoke earlier, and also just the guidance. And on the other part, we also encourage government to try and find knowledge management systems that we can use. Because what is happening at the moment is that we don't even have a monitoring and evaluation system in the country that ensures that most of the adaptation plans we're implementing are being monitored and their impact is being checked, and that we are learning from the mistakes that we're making, or we are improving those lessons that we're doing well on. So that whole machinery or that whole infrastructure for us needs to be created, and those are some of the things that we're looking at. Moving on to the actual heart of this paper, which is community-led retreat itself, we do acknowledge government has conceded that we don't have a comprehensive system on this, and the lack of that system might lead to disorganized withdrawals, and there is need for us to have a system that ensures that this is done orderly and it's done in a way that it's accountable and it's responsible. So part of the suggestion that the paper makes as part of the systems that we can look at, one option is a system that is voluntary, that is totally voluntary. Then the other one is an option of a system that has both voluntary aspects and other aspects are mandatory. We have suggested to the government that we support a combination of both voluntary and mandatory. Voluntary for those aspects of communities where they can actually do their own retreat, but mandatory in aspects where mostly communities cannot afford the cost of retreat, or it's after a disaster or after an impact. So those are the elements that we're looking at. Then, of course, there are also aspects around what should be the liability of decision makers in the process. What we've decided is a balance between protecting the decision makers, but at the same time ensuring that the decision makers are working within frameworks that ensure fairness and transparency. And that's why we've opted for option B. The last chapter, or the second last chapter, is funding. We are looking at financing from a perspective that we need a much more guaranteed and much more permanent funding system, and mostly one that does not look at post-disaster funding, but one that looks at pre-disaster funding, especially looking at the issue of adaptation. And that's where our focus, I think, in this chapter, as you go through the paper, you're going to realize that we're saying we want a very strong, clear direction of what government's role, central government's role is going to be, what local government's role is going to be, and of course the property owners or the communities. Then secondly, we want to ensure that there's a very clear funding mechanism that ensures that we are proactive. We are not reactive, but we are ensuring that we are creating the resilience before the impact. Managed retreat should be the last resort after we've done everything else, and therefore the funding mechanism should actually look into that. Moving on to 8, the issue of recovery after disasters is one that actually has continued to be an enduring debate, I guess, as to how far do we extend into our adaptation planning and thinking into the recovery phase. Our position essentially on this point is that our planning and our expenditure patterns should be one that are more focused on pre-disaster elements, and to ensure that we mitigate and ameliorate the possible impacts of any hazard that might take place at any point, and not wait for the recovery phase. Because in most cases, you get to find that the recovery usually costs more than the cost of mitigating the possible damage that could happen. I'll pause and end there for now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. That brings us to the end of the quick whip through the submission, draft submission, and we'll just hand over to Liam for questions. Or
Yep, so Mr. Chairman, the way the team's presented the presentation today, it's in quite a bit of detail because, of course, to allow you to not only digest the agenda and read it and have a good debate on the day, we thought it was important to highlight the direction, which is consistent with our previous positioning. They're providing a lot more detail, so we're able to go into more detail, but that's why it's a kind of a blow-by-blow in terms of what we're recommending. The report will be published when for Council's consideration?
Tomorrow?
Yeah, so we can provide a draft after this.
No, in terms
I think
of...
it's tomorrow.
It is, yeah, it's
because
going on.
the meeting's next week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's tomorrow evening, yeah. So over to you for questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I've got a two-parter. The first one is around highlighting working with mana whenua and community-led organisations. What have our conversations been with both our iwi mana whenua partners in Wellington, and have we checked in to see if they would like support writing their own submissions or vice versa?
Not on the submission. We have had, pardon me, we have had conversations to date with mana whenua around adaptation, and noting the leadership that's already existing in mana whenua around how they are choosing to adapt to climate change. We've had conversations recently to figure out what mana whenua are doing and understand what their plans are and how WCC can come in and support that. That's really early stage conversations, but we also are in collaboration with Porirua City Council to try and make that as easy as possible for mana whenua. Again, at this stage, very early stages, but we note that Ngāti Toa Rangatira in particular are already thinking about climate adaptation planning for their communities on a street-by-street case. And so we're trying to identify the opportunities as quick as possible to be able to help them action that plan with whatever resource, time, capacity we can give. Yeah, kia ora.
And then my second part was just around the strategy of lobbying a change of government, and if we hold any positions or in our opening letters around urgency, needing the third piece of clarity for local government, or kind of like enduring cross-party collaboration and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to note. Thank you, because I assume that, Liam, we will be writing information for the incoming government from us. Is that something that we do as a council?
Well, I think the Mayor's office is looking after that. Yeah, I think that a lot of government departments do briefing BIMs, I think they're called, briefing for incoming ministers, but I don't believe office has prepared anything. I don't know.
I guess it was more around the specific introduction of this bill. Submission. If there's a case that we can make as local government around our responsibilities under RMA. If we don't get the third piece of the RMA, we can't necessarily give good effect to our planning obligations.
I think that's good feedback, and we could probably add a paragraph to the cover letter that just sort of expresses our desire more than anything for some policy certainty, which we kind of say several times, but we can just beat them over the head with a club because it's worth repeating.
All good.
I just wanted to get clarity on that framing. I think was it community resettlement? Was that the way that, yeah. And so that was international best practice. Great. So that would also provide a global consistency in the way we're discussing it. Okay.
Exactly.
And then the other thing to note is we're one of the few countries that talks about managed retreat.
Oh.
That uses that as a metaphor.
Yeah.
Like it's not how the Netherlands talks about it.
Yeah, great.
So somehow we're at war with nature and we're losing. Like it's just wrong for us on so many levels. So we would like to encourage the government to move away from that language as well.
Yeah, great. Okay. Obviously, we've been working regionally on our climate adaptation plan. So have we been working regionally on the submission as well?
Really good question. We have been in close conversations with many of the councils across the region. We haven't worked on a regional submission from the region per se. That's primarily because working within these central government timeframes is pretty tricky. But as much as possible, we are trying to informally
to get that consistency, Okay. So yes, I'll leave that to you. Just the other one was that the climate like the standardisation makes good sense,
Yeah.
but I'm just aware that we've already done a lot of work. And so just in your overall snapshot, how far ahead would the Wellington region be in the work that we've done compared to the
Yeah.
nation?
Yeah, I'd say we're kind of in the middle. There's lots of other councils who are nowhere near as far ahead as we are, but there are also other councils who are further ahead, which is an opportunity for us to learn from those councils who are further on the journey, who are actively in the community adaptation planning process at the moment. Yeah, but we also have a lot of lessons to share from the Makara Beach and Alfero Bay projects that we have led in Wellington.
Yeah. Okay. And one more question then. Have we had a chance, I'm sure we have, but have we taken on community feedback as part of our submission?
Not in a formal sense, but I guess from an officer perspective, that has very much been in our minds.
Experience.
Yes, but welcome additions as you're reading the submission, please.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
bring that through.
Great, thanks for this. Looking at your proposals, I feel that the language is actually too strong for an incoming government because we don't know what they think at the moment, and so we don't know what they're going to actually ask for. So I think that we should actually get a feel for that before we actually come out and say we strongly support this or that. And I also think that the whole plan should actually be community-led. Like, we should be asking people in Makara or the low-lying areas, Kilburnie, what other low-lying areas do we have? Whatever they are, we should be asking them what do they think. Like, if we have sea level rise, say in Kilburnie, what would they actually like to do? Would they like to? Do they see themselves moving into a higher area, or do they have thinking on that? Like, they might say that, look, we want to build a seawall and we want to stay where we are. So shouldn't that be head of all the things that we do?
You are absolutely right, Councillor, and that is the principle that underpins the community engagement roadmap that you considered and approved in April. The intention and the design is definitely to work with communities and to bring to life their aspirations. So to give them the support, the information that they need, the technical assessments, so that we can work through the forward plan together. There's absolutely, because you're absolutely right, plans done to people are horrible. And I think what you're seeing in Hawke's Bay play out is the weather has done it, and now the government will need to figure out how they respond to that. And we want to get into a proactive space where we have those plans in advance of events. Your comments on, is the language too strong? Thank you for that feedback, and we'll go away and think about that a little bit. The issues and options paper that we're responding to asks us, do you like this? Do you like that? Here's our thoughts. What do you think? So I guess it's we're responding to a report written by officials at MFE as opposed to the government of the day. But we will have a think about your feedback. Thank you.
Great, that's excellent. Thanks. So I just think that when you take a very strong position, it doesn't leave the other side a lot of wiggle room. They think that you're absolutely set on this. Whereas if you say we believe that this should be done because of these reasons here, I think it's a lot more reasonable, and then they'll say, okay, we agree with you, and we'll go along with you. So that's why I think that.
Yes, thank you. I've got some questions, but I do want to just support Councillor Chung's comment about the strength of the language. I think without actually having active community engagement behind us, I think we should be a little more moderate in where we're pushing. Be clear, but maybe moderate about the certainty until we've consulted with the impacted communities. If they are strong about something, then we should be strong, of course. So my questions, first of all, in terms of there's a phrase in there which is strongly supported. This is a Maori-led approach. And I'm just wondering if there's an example of what that means in terms of what approach would happen if it wasn't a Maori-led approach.
Sorry, can I have a repeat of the last part of that question?
No, just saying, we're obviously coming up with approaches to deal with climate change. There's a strong support for Maori-led approaches. What's an example of a Maori-led approach?
So Māori are have already been addressing climate change for hundreds of years, long before colonisation started. Māori have been adapting to the environment and practicing what adapting to the environment in relation to the environment looks like. And so when we consider a Mataranga Māori approach, that's informed by those principles of sustainability that Māori practice. It's informed by their knowledge of the area and the protection of their taonga assets, so their marae, the whenua that they whakapapa to, all those different things that are uniquely and spiritually Māori. And so when we consider a Māori-led approach, those are all the things that go into it. It's not Wellington City Council coming in and overlaying an approach on Māori that may not necessarily work for them, because those kind of approaches have been what have put Māori in positions where they can't respond historically. And so by considering a Māori-led approach, we're aligning to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, aligning to Tākaihere, aligning to Tupiki Ora, and giving Māori that space where they can actually practice their rangatiratanga and decide for them what is going to be good for Māori as they respond to climate change.
Okay, so a Maori-led approach is an approach that has space for Maori to make the key decisions that is going to be enacted to support the climate adaptation.
Yeah. So that will be an approach that is decided alongside Māori, whatever their governance structure looks like. However that's set up, Māori have to be at the forefront of that. So if it's affecting directly Māori land that Māori whakapapa to, that they occupy, that has to be done in relationship with Māori who live in that area, with mana whenua.
Yeah, and look, I absolutely understand that, of course. So I guess, in a sense, because it also comes through the need for standardised language, the ability to share information, I'm just wondering whether there's a tension between those two elements, not to detract from the support for a Maori-led approach, but if you were having individual itemised elements dotted all around, that sort of detracts, or there's a tension. I just question whether there's a tension there, whether you need to address that in your submission.
I think that's navigable and not an issue. So I don't think that's something that that is unresolvable.
No, I don't see that as a tension point either. I think that's just an acknowledgement of the many documents and agreements that we've signed up to already, notably within Council, with Tākaihere, Tupiki Ora. These are all things that we said we'd commit to in relationship with mana whenua. And so just by acknowledging that, we're committing to things that we've already agreed to within Council already.
Okay, and lastly, just really following up on the question about Council versus regional. I know, I understand that you've got a short time frame, you've got to turn it around, you want to make a good exercise, and I just note though that when it comes to a lot of the urban planning direction, and it's heading in a regional basis around Wellington, and I'm just wondering whether or not that needs to be noted in the Wellington City Council at the appropriate level by which you want this level of responsibility to come to the council, and whether you want it to go, whether response you want to go through the council into the regional level, or whether it should be just assigned from the government directly to the regional, to the building regional institutions that we're having.
It would be great if we did more regional submissions. In practice, we find them impossible to achieve. We've tried more than once on different submissions. It's just to get the timing, and each individual council has to sign off their submission. Like we've tried in the past and failed. So now we just kind of do individual ones. But having said that, we do talk to each other a lot. Our key messages are the same as the key messages of other councils in the region. And we also, there's a national network of climate change officers who work on adaptation, and they have given us the whole nation of climate change related officers a list of the key points from that kind of professional community. Liam?
Tony, was it you, just trying to clarify your question, were you talking more about process from adaptation?
I was more talking about what the submission's saying about where the direction is for who is going to, what institutions are going to be the anchor for the climate adaptation
Good point.
planning.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not clear on that. It's a good point. I think Sean's going to probably say something as well. But that's something the submission could actually provide a bit more clarity on, because that, of course, is also uncertain. So.
Yes, and with the potential repeal of the Spatial Planning Act, that had most of those regional instruments within it. So you'll have to appreciate these officers will be operating in peak uncertainty until such time as we see what that RMA reform looks like.
But I think, to Councillor Randall's point, we'll acknowledge that in the submission, just add a statement to that effect.
Yeah, I just note too, if it's so hard to get a submission done regionally, then the idea of doing really difficult climate adaptation investments doesn't bode well. I just want to be clear from the council's point of view, and I suspect, and maybe I would suggest that given that the regional institutions are still being developed, that should be the council's position, is to say, look, council-led, but recognising that this council was going to move towards a regional framework, but we're not there yet. Something like that, and just to be clear, just so that the government can see where we're at and where we're going.
Yeah, I think, okay, we'll take that on board. Thanks for your comment. I'm just looking at the time. Ray, you had a question, I think. We're not moving Ray. Right. Okay.
Cool. This is more of our, even though it's not legislatively required, are we just expecting the central government to do something, and do we have any plan as a council that can be done? This is a great submission, but for the community that expect us to move a little bit forward, I don't know when this government is going to, committed to do some of those things. Is there anything planned from council perspective, or any thought in that regard?
Yes, we have the community engagement roadmap that you approved in April, which has a variety of phases to it. We're currently in phases 1 and 2, which involves increasing awareness around climate change impacts and working with community groups and local communities around their understanding of climate change, how they want to approach it, what they want to do, and how we can support them to do things. We are planning to provide you with an update of where that program of work is at, and I'm going to split it by ward so that you can see who we're talking to in your individual parts of the city. And we're also super keen to hear from you if there are any people that you have been talking to who are interested in climate change or want support around these issues. So I would refer you back to the roadmap in terms of what we're planning going forward. We are very conscious that we're trying to support community adaptation in the absence of a clear policy framework from central government and some of the key planks that we need. We do not have the funding, financing and regulatory mechanisms that we need to do a good job on behalf of our residents. We will do what we can because we must, but that's the purpose of this kind of submission, is to keep raising that point with central government that they really need to provide that to us so that we can avoid being the next Hawke's Bay and instead be super resilient.
Kia ora, team. Thanks so much for that. Hey, just keen to hear a bit more about that difference between voluntary and mandatory retreat, and what precisely some kind of prescribed backstop would look like on the mandatory side of things.
Okay, I'll take that. Essentially, the whole system, if built in, it needs to have a couple of safeguard processes, though. So the first part is that any community will have people that can be able to actually afford insurance and can be able to afford to finance their own relocation from certain aspects post an event. You get to find that in the same area, there will be people that cannot afford to be able to finance their moving. And that's where those that can move prior or before the event happens can be given that leeway and that flexibility to go through, and mostly using either market-driven processes like insurance or another system that the government can put in place. And this is where the conversation is as to, does government come in with its own insurance system, or do we still remain in the market space? But whichever it is, people should be given the option to opt before the event to be able to move out of a place. The mandatory part comes in mostly when you get to find that people, for whatever reason, for many reasons, have decided to stay in a place that is actually disaster prone. And they have asked for instance, protective infrastructure like seawalls and all those things. And to some extent, those seawalls hold, and at times they don't hold. But when a certain level of damage is actually experienced, it has to be a decision that has to be taken by an authority that is yet to be decided in this, because we don't have a system that says it's enough. We have provided enough protection, we've provided enough services. It's beginning to be more costly to provide these services over this period of time, and the damage or the possible risk has grown. And therefore, based on the science and the evidence that we have, we are now mandating that this area be evacuated. So those are some of the things that we want clarity from government as to how is this system going to look like. When do people...
And just to be clear, we don't want to ever end up in that position where we are mandatorily removing people.
We've got 1 minute, and so I allocate myself the last question. And then you can all sort of, have a free fall, let these guys out of the room. So I just think this is more of an observation than a question. I did have several questions, but I'll just one observation. It's actually, I found it quite hard to actually conceptualize some of the meaning of what you're talking about. And I would really like us to actually think, especially in respect to the community engagement, around perhaps more case studies, because it's very hard to look at some of the descriptive words you've used to work out, from a, I'm thinking of, I'm sure like most people, you look at it from a personal relevance, and to an extent, case studies help you understand, because you can put yourself in the shoes of somebody else and go, right, so that's how it will actually affect me, I think this is great. I'm sure you're going to get more feedback the next week or so before the thing goes in, but a lot of our job, isn't it, is to actually educate the community, as well as your job is to help educate the people around this table.
Yeah, I mean, submissions to parliamentary inquiries are not exactly thrilling reading, but we are happy to do a workshop on community engagement and adaptation if you want one.
Yeah, but look, I mean, my observation about the parliamentarians, they aren't necessarily any smarter than members of the community, and a dry submission. Some of the conversations I've had with some of the guys who've sat through all of the stuff around the Three Waters reform, and they say they've heard the whole lot, and I'm thinking, did you understand any of it? So don't underestimate or don't overestimate the ability of people to comprehend the meaning of what you've just told us, because without a case study, it can be really hard.
So if the submission, or taking that on board with, we can find some we can point to. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.